Hello, everyone. We hope you can see us and hear us. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you very much for registering to listen to this new report that we've been working on at the Kosovar Centre for Security Studies. My name is Jeta Loshaj, and I work as a researcher at KCSS. And the speakers that we have with us today are Mr. National Ilazi, who's the head of research at KCSS, Ms. Katarina Tadić, who's a program manager at the European Fund for the Balkans. And with us, we also have Mr. Shpetim Gashi, who's the Vice Director of the Council for Inclusive Governance. This activity is part of a project that is supported by NED, so National Endowment for Democracy. The project is titled Promoting Government Transparency and Accountability in Interethnic Dialogue. There's a couple of activities that we are still implementing as part of this project, but one of these, and one of them is also this report, through which we have tried to provide a picture as to what has been going on with the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia over the past 4 years. There is an impression that some developments did take place, but there was also a lot of stagnation, as there's a general perception that right now there is not as many movements, either in the negative or positive direction, which is why we decided to draft this report. And that is why we engaged both Katarina and Shpetim to provide two different perspectives, because in most developments, there is an impression that one side has one side of the story and the other side has another interpretation. But we would like to emphasize that both Katarina, who's from Serbia, and Shpetim from Kosovo, they have been asked and challenged to draft these papers independently. So the summaries that they're going to present are on the capacities of analysts and authors, not that they necessarily represent the views of either Kosovo or Serbia. In this webinar, we'll have first Ms. Katarina to present briefly for about 10 minutes what she views is are the main developments, either achievements or setbacks or the unknowns, as opposed to the Kosovo Serbia dialogue. And then we'll give the floor also to Shpetim to provide the Kosovo perspective, again, independently. And then we'll have National Ilazi just wrap up everything and see the sort of merged perspective as to what are the main takeaways and what could possibly be the way forward. And then in the end, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A from the audience. So feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section. So we can already start with the presentation of Katarina. And by the way, this report is already actually in KCSS's website. You can access it and read it, and feel free to write to us for any questions you may have. And yeah, so Katarina, if you're ready, we can start with your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jeta. It was a real pleasure working with you and with Dani on this research and this project. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. As Jeta explained, my task, so to say, was to write a paper, an analysis on the Serbia's perspective of the dialogue with Kosovo, and somehow the focus was on the transparency of the inclusion of civil society and the accountability of the entire process. So I will discuss it more in detail, but I can say that from the Serbia's perspective, or at least like my perspective of Serbia's role, is that there is let's say like the genuine dialogue on the normalization between Serbia and Kosovo has definitely stalled. There are several milestones that I will mention a bit later, also many setbacks in the dialogue process, but the overall impression is that the political situation in Serbia is some integral part of the dialogue process, and what we have been witnessing in the past for 5 years is giving us an impression that a government that resorts to repression, to institutional control, is not democratic, and therefore it cannot be genuinely committed to the peace building in the region, including the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina. However, we were looking. So the framework that we were exploring was after the Washington Agreement 2020 until today. In terms of milestones, these are definitely the agreement on the path of normalization, which is the Ohrid Agreement, and implementation annex. Then I also identified the cooperation on missing persons from 2023, also as one of the milestones. Then recognition of license plates from December 2023, and also I mentioned, even though it's not officially part of the dialogue process, but the return of the contested land to Visoki Dečani Monastery is also as one of the milestones, because it addressed a long-standing issue that was affecting the relationship between the Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo and the government in Pristina. However, the overall impression is that some of these milestones were also turned into setbacks. So, for example, the implementation challenges of the post-Ohrid agreement. Then, before that, in 2020, the resignation of Serbs from the north of Kosovo from their position in state institution, and it was something that was dictated from Belgrade. So this was especially an indicator of the tight control that Belgrade has over Kosovo Serbs, and also an indicator that an integration that we were witnessing in the past 10 years or so was never genuine, but that was dictated and basically controlled by Belgrade. Then also one of the setbacks was also the closure of Serbian-backed institutions, or so-called parallel institutions in Kosovo, and as well as tensions and security incidents, when Banjska is definitely the most serious security incident that affects the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia. However, like the main take of my analysis and of my paper is what I said at the beginning, and this is that the dialogue with Kosovo cannot be separated from the political situation in Serbia. And somehow it became clear over the past 4 years that the involvement of Vučić, of the regime in Belgrade, in the dialogue with Kosovo, that the aim of this involvement was never even the EU integration of Serbia, but it really became clear that the aim was just to secure EU and US support internationally, while internally Serbia was turning into Russian or Belarusian style of autocracy, and this is something that we definitely seeing today. So we see political polarization, we see criminalization of the economy, of the society, we have illegal detentions. So since the summer last year, practically in the first wave between August and September, around 50 environmental activists were detained or arrested, and now there was a new wave of arrest and intimidation of activists during this latest protest that are now lasting for 6 months. So these developments are also consequential for the dialogue, also because of the role of the civil society, because if we are talking about
Okay, it appears that Katarina's internet may have interrupted her presentation, but we'll just wait a couple of seconds to see if she can get back to the meeting. Well, let's see. Maybe Katarina will be able to rejoin us, and we will ask her to continue where she left off. And now we'll ask Mr. Shpetim Gashi to start with his presentation, because based on the report we received from Katarina, she was also close to the end of her presentation. So Shpetim, if you can start with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Jeta, and thank you to you and Dani and your colleagues for giving us this opportunity. And I mean, I can also continue with Serbia's perspective, because I know what Serbs think better than Albanians, actually. So Katarina doesn't have to come back. But on my, yes, dialogue is not new. And I think that this paper that I wrote together with you, there isn't much new there, but I think the benefit of it is that it has 4 years of Kurdi's government in 6-7 pages. So it's synthesized, and it's from what I've seen, basically it's an observation. It's not what I think it should be done or should have been done, but it's just an observation of what I've seen the government been doing. Some things could be wrong, something could be right. And the paper is titled "The North First." Maybe just in a couple of minutes explain how did the North become first topic when nobody expected it, and then but before I go to the North, just a couple of sentences about the dialogue. Why Kosovo hasn't been engaged as much as many expected, or as the EU and the US expected. I think that this government, and including also the opposition parties, they believe that the Brussels dialogue in its current format has actually completed its mandate, that it has achieved what it could achieve, the car plates and energy. And I think that Kosovo, they may not admit it, but they feel that they're the victors in this dialogue. They got energy independence, they got IBM, the 2 gates in the north. And Serbia did get a date for the EU, but Kosovo got more practical things. And in addition to that, Kosovo did not implement its biggest point, which was the ASM. So far, I think Kosovo seems to be the winner in that dialogue. How did and then why now in the Kosovo side they say we will engage constructively dialogue only if recognition is on the table, because Serbia, there is nothing else that Serbia could give us. There is nothing we could give to Serbia. And so recognition is on the table. That's a red line for Serbia. EU says, no, the dialogue's mandate is not recognition, it's normalization. And then it has stalled. On how did the North become first? First, it's about 10% of Kosovo's territory, and sometimes I read they say some say 17-18%, but it's 10%. It's 1,000 kilometers square. So people confuse the territories of other Serb majority municipalities, and it's a big chunk of territory for any country. So and then we had I think what changed the whole thing was geopolitics that tilted sharply in Kurdi's favor with Russia-Ukraine war. Serbia had its hands tied. EU started to suspect that Serbia could be a proxy. And then Serbia moves fast. In fact, publicly supporting Ukraine and selling weapons. Officially 800 millions, but unofficial numbers say it could go up to 2 billions. But it still had its hands tied. And I think that Kurti and his government saw the moment. And then they said, let's reshape the situation on the ground. First, they banned elections, Serbian elections for the first time, referendum. And then they moved with the police and dismantling the parallel structures. And you know, the rest, Serbs boycotted the institutions. And nobody expected that then Kosovo would move swiftly and organize an election with 2-3% shaky legitimacy, having Albanian mayors there. And it worked, kind of. It worked for Kurti. And NATO, in a way, ended up inadvertently being Kurti's army. Whenever Kosovo police was in trouble, NATO was there to protect them. And they were the first line, the line between police and protesters. So then, in a way, that was a victory. I think that one could say that this 10% of territory, which was contested a couple of years ago, one could say that now it's in Prishtina's full control, not the people. I understand the Serbs there, they've never been more alienated towards Kosovo's government. The people, but as we know in our corner of the Balkans, people don't really matter much. It's the land that matters. And I think that was the aim of this government. And the people either adjust or, they adjust. They usually adjust. And so this is how I think it kind of became the North first. It was an opportunity. Kurti took advantage. I don't think it was an ad hoc actions. People were saying elections, this, election, that. I think it was a strategy. And it was a gamble, but it worked. So now I'm just, in the paper, I've listed 5 points as Kosovo's main elements of this strategy with the dialogue. And one is the dismantling of the Serbian institutions, or as some of us know them as parallel institutions. And I think this is also, the idea is to eventually weaken an eventual association. If you dismantle the parallel institutions, if you take over the public property, which according to the latest draft, EU draft on association, is supposed to be managed by the association and all these companies. So dismantling everything, and I think what's left now is basically education and healthcare. And I wouldn't be surprised if Kosovo's government or Kurti's government moves in pushing these institutions to register within Kosovo's institution. That would be, I think, quite problematic, because the Kosovo Serb community would see this as an attack on their identity. Education, as we know, and nobody knows this better than the Albanians. The 90s, the reason we reject the Serbian system. I mean, the subjects were all the same, but we saw it as an identity, as our soul. So I can see some backlash if Kurti moves, or the new government moves towards kind of dismantling, in a way, the Serbian education and health system. The number 2 strategy is the de facto recognition. I think the Kosovo's government is well aware that the recognition from Serbia is not going to come anytime soon, probably not in our lifetime. But they say if you could get some de facto recognition, the way they define it is that Serbia finds a way to give up territorial claims on Kosovo. This could be through constitutional changes, such as removing Kosovo from 2 or 3 articles, or through, like the Ohrid Agreement. In a way, it was close to a de facto definition that would satisfy Kosovo's government. The third is recognition by the 5 EU members. This, I think, when we talk to some of the government people, they say they've been more engaged than it looks publicly. And then Kurti and then some Vedvendosje people, they say the reason they accepted the Ohrid Agreement is because some international diplomats told them, they did not promise, but they told them, quote, "We're confident that some of the 5 will move on." And this just the promise was enough to make Kosovo sign. So this just shows how important it is. And now most of the Kosovo government say this is the top priority, not Serbia's recognition. They say we can live without Serbia's recognition. And they say that we can bypass it. So you can bypass, it's complicated, but it's not as important as it was a few years ago. And these 5 non-recognizers, apparently they said that we don't need recognition from Serbia to recognize you, but we need a legally binding agreement. And this is what sold Kosovo in Ohrid. And I think the reason that Kosovo backed off from the Ohrid agreement is not the fact that it's not signed or that Bernabe sent a letter to the EU, is the fact that none of the 5 EU members made the move to recognize. So Kosovo feels betrayed by internationals about the Ohrid. And prioritizing NATO, a lot of government officials, and they say that the EU is probably more difficult. You have Cyprus, and then they have conditions, but NATO is at least it looks to them it's easier, could be easier. And then if they get into NATO, the security guarantees that come with it, that would kind of seal the border, that would secure the border with Serbia, because they see it's always a risk. And then point number 5 was the international membership of the international organization, the So Council of Europe. Kurti did some compromise that few of us expected, like, for instance, the land with the Dechani monastery, which 5 prime ministers before him had failed to do so. And so these are the 5 challenges ahead in that paper I just lay out in a couple paragraphs. The biggest challenge for Kosovo is the ASM, and now it's no longer just a domestic, local issue. It's become an international issue. It's become an international condition for Kosovo to move forwards in an organization such as Council of Europe. And then number 2 is the challenge that Serbia's recognition will not come anytime soon. So Kosovo will have to navigate a way to continue normalizing relations with Serbia while the latter claims Kosovo as its own territory, its constitution, laws. And then the 3rd is that partition seems to be off the table. Now, a lot of people fear that with Trump, this might come back to the table, but Trump seems busy with other things, including his idea to become a pope. So I don't think he'll have time to deal with our north. And then the U.S. engagement seems like it may decrease. And some of you mentioned the Washington Agreement. So that's not likely for anyone to pick up on it, because it's mostly infrastructure projects, and nobody has money for it. And then U.S. troops. There was a lot of talk about U.S. troops withdrawing from Kosovo, and but I think it's not a big challenge. It's only 10% of the NATO troops, and many EU countries have shown willingness that would replace these U.S. troops, but also very unlikely that U.S. will withdraw these troops, because they're not combat troops. They're National Guard units that they go through training in Kosovo. If not in Kosovo, we go through training in some other state in the U.S., some other country. So it doesn't really cost anything for the U.S. And the last one that I make there, the EU sanctions on Kosovo. So I expect them to be lifted, most likely after the local elections in October, when the Serb mayors and assemblies will take over local institutions in the north. So this is my brief presentation. Thank you, Jeta and Dani.
Okay, thank you, Shpetim, for the summary of your chapter. I'll re-emphasize that the report is on our website, and everyone can read it in greater detail there. Katarina, if you can hear us now, you can proceed from where you left. You left
thank
off.
you. Yeah, apologies.
Yeah.
It's just I got disconnected on all my devices. I couldn't even use hotspot. I don't know what happened. Maybe government is spying on me. So
that's what we were thinking. Yeah.
Don't call them a regime. Don't call them a regime. It's a democratically elected government.
Not really, but okay. So I think that our presentations reflect the different structures of Shpetim's and my paper, but it's let's say they reflect the different situation in both Kosovo and Serbia in a sense, and this is where I stopped. That I wanted to say is that somehow the dialogue is not the topic that much in Serbia as it maybe was before. So even if you look at the civil society, who was traditionally interested and included in the entire EU integration process, so now the most prominent civil society organization, they just cease, they just stop cooperating with the government institutions because they don't want to legitimize the repression and the abuse of power that we are witnessing. And to some extent, the cooperation with the government became a reputational risk for many civil society organizations in Serbia. And then it's also reflected on the dialogue, because before we had calls for the dialogue to be more inclusive, to include civil society, to consult civil society organization and representatives. Somehow that's not even the topic anymore, because the entire public discourse and in Serbia was practically is burdened with other issues that are more related to the democratic functioning of the country, to corruption, as I said, to the increasing repression. We see also the increasing and I would say unprecedented civic mobilization in the past 6 months. And in this also context, the government tried to control the narrative and to again use these nationalistic sentiments and to exploit some historic symbolism as well, and then to accuse students or activists of being foreign agents. They try to portray protests in Novi Sad as calls for the succession of Vojvodina. However, so far the regime is not succeeding in that, luckily. So we see that the topics that are now dominant in Serbia are more related to the functioning of the institutions. They're more related to the complete capture of the society in the country, and not to the resolving the issue of Kosovo. However, what I want to say is that it doesn't mean that the society here or political actors on both sides, let's say either in the government or the opposition, would be willing or prepared to accept Kosovo independence. But it just means that these internal struggles are now becoming more dominant than these issues such as Kosovo, that the government was always exploiting it for their own purpose and in a very nationalistic terms. When it comes to the role of the EU, well, we heard many times, it's becoming now like a commonplace that the relationship can be described as transactional. So practically, the EU is turning a blind eye to this rising authoritarianism in Serbia, but in exchange for some economic, geopolitical consideration, and lithium is let's say the latest example. So we have now this also very paradoxical situation where on the one hand the EU is still supporting Vučić, even though we had now the Marta Kos visit in Belgrade, where we saw that the rhetoric is a bit changed, but still officially the EU is still supporting Vučić. And the paradox is that this government is genuinely anti-EU and anti-Western, and still gets support from the EU, even though that base of this government will never become the EU, but the allies of the EU, so those people now on the street and protesting, are somehow getting alienated from the EU, exactly because of the support that the EU is still giving to Vučić and to the government in Serbia. And that, of course, then affects also the dialogue, because the EU doesn't have a credibility anymore in the process, but also the EU integration process itself somehow is turning into some kind of a performance and not into a process that would actually lead to Serbia's membership in the EU. So I will stop here, and then maybe we can discuss some other issues now with if there are some questions. So thank you.
Okay. No, thank you, Katarina, and no worries about the internet thing. We're also struggling with technical issues. It really helps to have your perspective because you're there, you're in Serbia, you're in Belgrade, and it's really important to have the perspective from what is there on the ground, as opposed to just the one perspective we have in the respective countries. I'm sure the audience and we have questions for you, but now we'll give the floor to Donnie. Maybe just briefly the synthesis that we talked about. How do you see it in sort of from a MERS perspective as to what are the main takeaways, and what do the developments of the past 4 years tell us about the situation with the dialogue, and if there's anything at all we can perhaps forecast over this year, as much as unpredictable the situation is overall, just to hear your views, because you constantly deal with this topic as well.
Thank you, Jeta, and thanks to Katarina and Shpetim for their remarks. From my end, I've been asked by Jeta to do some kind of a summary of the key points mentioned in the papers of Shpetim and Katarina, but I will also maybe add some of my own take. But later, perhaps after I finish, I would be very interested to hear from Katarina about the student protests and, you know, how the dialogue, their relations with Kosovo, in a way, if they ever were addressed, and from Shpetim about, you know, you mentioned US in a passing, but you know, potentially it could be a game changer in the process. So from my end, let me try to summarize a bit, and then also add some of the points of how I see the process. So I think what both Shpetim and Katarina are saying is that there is when we look at the dialogue, there are achievements that often may be overlooked with the dialogue. For instance, Kosovo has now the telephone code, the energy agreement. As a result of the normalization dialogue, Kosovo got the Stabilization Association Agreement with the EU. Serbia moved as well with the candidate status and opening negotiations with the European Union. So both sides benefited significantly from the dialogue process, not only improving the lives of the people in both countries, but also improving the overall situation in terms of the European integration process. However, that's the big footnote there that Katarina mentioned, that sometimes prioritizing a dialogue and rewarding the behavior in dialogue came at the cost of perhaps ignoring democratic backsliding or democratic norms, especially in the case of Serbia. Overall, we have two major agreements at the political level that were reached in this process, and this is also important to note. So it's the 2013 agreement on the principles governing normalization of relations. This agreement has, in a way, 5 parts. The first 6 points are about the association or community of Serb majority municipalities, and that part is about advancing the what later we called self-management capacity for the Kosovo Serb community. The second part of the agreement is about police integration or security integration in the north. As a result of that agreement, we had a process of bringing many people who were part of parallel or illegal structures of security in the north become part of the Kosovo police. The third aspect was integration of judiciary in the north with the rest of the country, and that also moved forward. The other aspect was integration of the municipal structures. So for the first time after 2013, we had the elections organized in the north, and we had mayors elected through Kosovo legislation. And the last part is where both sides then agree that they have, in a way, separate path towards European integration process, and neither will block the other. But arguably the most comprehensive and perhaps important agreement is the agreement on a path to normalization of relations, which the government in Kosovo calls as the basic agreement. This was reached in process in February. And this is, I think, the most ambitious agreement yet achieved between the two parts, an agreement that you can say provides that function, what we call that KCSS, functional recognition or de facto recognition. The principle in 2013 agreement where both parties agree not to block each other's EU perspective of European integration process turns into a commitment not to block each other's membership in international organizations, recognition that each will speak on its own voice, and basically recognizing the legal and constitutional, in a way, reality that is in Kosovo. You can make the point that the agreements on integrated border management, IBM, or other agreements from the process of the dialogue also indicated or implied this kind of recognition of different legal reality, legal authority in Kosovo. Now, what have been the challenges? I think context matters. So we need to put these results in the framework that we are talking 14 years since the process started in March of 2011. So, basic question is, are we happy with these results for the last, they took 14 years. Obviously, without this process, perhaps the relations would have been far worse and the region for itself would have been far less stable. So there is also that other context that we need to take into account. But nonetheless, there are crucial and important achievements from the process we shouldn't ignore. Now, the challenges is, the key question is, do we have political leadership that want to actually achieve full normalization of relations? And this has been especially a question, for instance, in Serbian leadership. Do we want full normalization of relations, and what does that mean? When we look at the documents from the EU defines as the target to call this process complete. Shpetim, I think, was a bit perhaps fast to call the process, as a mission accomplished, because if you look from the EU documents, even from the agreement on a path to normalization of relations, the EU says that the process is done when the parties reach a comprehensive, legally binding agreement. And I think this is key. And I think it's a euphemism from the part of EU that this legally binding implies some level of recognition between the two sides. So I don't think we are there yet. Is this process going to deliver that? It's another question. So, but EU cannot want normalization of relations more than the leaders. And this has been a message we've been hearing from Brussels, Berlin, and Paris. And I think it's a fair point. The second internal challenge has to do with utilizing dialogue for internal politicking, or as it was mentioned by both Katarina and Shpetim, using it for internal framing of blaming challenges. So the dialogue, relations with Kosovo in Serbia, and the dialogue always become a favorite target for President Vučić whenever there is some internal issue coming up. And similarly, in Kosovo, we have been seeing actors promoting normalization of relations, often framed in a very negative discourse. Third is the lack of cohesion within both societies. In Serbia, this is framed somehow as democratization before normalization. This is something we hear from our colleagues. So what we are often hearing is that we need to have a effective or functioning democratic Serbia in order to have normalization of relations with Kosovo, that any normalization now would lack that kind of legitimacy that it would need for the Serbian society. In case of Kosovo, we have different and often antagonistic approaches to the normalization dialogue, although in recent time, perhaps this kind of divergence has merged, because one of the main opponents of the process has been leading the normalization dialogue the last 4 years. And I think there is a deeper understanding of the process, and there can be a greater potential for creating cohesion. But cohesion is also mentioned as an challenge or internal challenges. So these three would be those internal challenges. External challenges have to do, first of all, I think what both Shpetim and Katarina perhaps are hinting is at the ambition of the EU as the facilitator of this dialogue. Also, does the EU want to see this process in a way conclude? And do they have or do they want to use the political capital, or do they have even the political capital to see this process at a conclusion? And then who in the EU, right? We have the European Commission leading the process with EAS, but often member states are also interfering or playing an important part in the process. For the first time in the last 4 years, since the process started, we saw a parallel, sort of a parallel track develop with the envoys of the prime ministers of the major European member states that are that focus on the Western Balkans, like Germany, France, and Italy. Basically, initially framed as putting weight behind Mr. Lajčák, but also in a way running a bit of their own track. So from our perspective, and if you read the papers, I think the implication, the fundamental understanding is that if there would be a certain level of cohesion within EU, where the EU would clearly outline the end result and expectations of the process, that then the process could potentially reach a conclusion. But we don't know if this is the kind of ambition right now in the EU. Our impression in Pristina from the last visits of the new envoy for the dialogue is that this ambition lacks. That if anything, the new envoy's priority will be to focus on technical aspects and implementation of existing agreements rather than to kind of have some kind of major breakthrough. But this is our own interpretation, our own reading. Perhaps we are wrong. Hopefully we are wrong and there will be a more ambitious side. The second external challenge that is implied in the paper has to do with, let's call it, extent and quality of the US engagement in this dialogue. The US has framed its role from the start as being supportive of the EU. So in a way, in the analogy that EU likes to use, EU was the, in the driving seat and US was on supporting that in the back seat, supporting the process. However, in recent time, we saw this role a bit change or transform. And what we are watching with a lot of, I think, focus and apprehension is how will potential approach or agreement on Ukraine unfold, and what would be the implications of that for our region and for the process of normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. So these are, I think, major points from my reading of the two papers and our joint synthesis with Jeta, which Jeta took a lead in framing. So these would be my points from my end. How we move forward, I think it's on these challenges. I think it's the ambition of the EU to define clearly the process, to be able to manage these, what in the paper we call geopolitical interests with democratic norms. We are having in mind here the recent minerals deal between EU and Serbia. So in a way, Serbia's geopolitical relevance, it seems to be increasing for the EU. So would the EU inside be able to master the kind of will to both support democratic developments in the country as well as normalization of relations? So perhaps it's too much for EU to manage at a certain at the moment. So will EU move from management to resolution? It will depend on how much Commission and Member State can potentially come to speak with one voice, and we have cohesion in our region, in both countries and EU.
Okay, thank you, Donny, for the summary. As it was pointed out also in the beginning, but also Shpetim mentioned, these are just mere observations. And that's why, based on the paper and the title of the paper, we wrote about achievements, setbacks, and unknowns. And it appears that there's a lot of unknowns, and certainly more unknowns than achievements and or setbacks. So, Dani, you had two questions, one for Katarina and one for Shpetim, but we have some, perhaps we just let the audience ask a few questions, if that's okay. We have one by Fatmir Fazliou. So for everyone, just check the Q&A question to write your questions there. He's a doctoral researcher at University of Helsinki, and he has a question for Katarina. What role does the Serbian Orthodox Church play on the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo? Katarina, did you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat it? Because I was reading, I'm trying to find where the Q&A. Can I see the Q&A questions? Or
I think you should be able to.
I was trying to find it, but I wasn't listening. I'm sorry. Can you just
No,
repeat
no,
the
no worries.
Yeah,
we have
you
a
can see
question.
the question as well, right? If you click Q&A at the bar, but yeah, maybe you can. And you have one from Eriona as well then later.
Okay.
Yes. The question is, what role does the Serbian Orthodox Church play on the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia?
Well, so far, the head of the Serbian Orthodox Church was very in line with the Vučić policy on Kosovo. We didn't see any disagreements there. So it seems that the Serbian Orthodox Church, at least in Belgrade, is completely happy with the process as it was going so far. So, I mean, to be honest, I'm not an expert on some maybe internal disagreements within the church and maybe between the Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo and, as I said, the council in Belgrade. But what we see on the outside, when it comes to at least the official position of the church, they didn't interfere in any way into the process of the dialogue, or they didn't express any disagreements with the way that the dialogue was led by the government.
Okay, thank you, Katarina. Eriona Ayvaze has raised her hand. And then we have a question by Artan Choloko. Eriona, if you can hear us, you can unmute your microphone.
Sure, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, and it is such a great honor to be in this panel. I am Eriona, I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Graz in Austria. My dissertation topic is on the language use, basically the mediation language on the Kosovo Serbia dialogue. I am currently analyzing the use of language from a CDA perspective. So I heard Mr. Ilazi speaking about euphemisms, and that is what I'm currently using on my dissertation topic. And I would like to maybe ask you about your perceptions of like to what extent has the EU facilitated dialogue reproduced a discourse of neutrality, because we know that the euphemisms and bias, non-neutrality are really interlinked. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Riona, for your question. Dan, would you like to?
Yeah. Briefly, I'm sure, Eriona, you already are aware with the book Vjosa Musliu wrote, EUizing. She focuses a lot on the CDA, critical discourse analysis, and the language behind. I would highly recommend her writing, but also there is a good article from Katarina Gashi on this aspect of the language and how EU produced neutrality through these kind of technical terms. And it is true, I would agree that what EU called, right, constructive ambiguity, calling, for instance, in IBM, using the slash, right, the border slash boundary, all of this enabled both parties, I guess, to move towards compromise, but it also normalized in a way the situation where both parties perhaps do not need to directly deal with each other, or reduce the pressure for either to fully recognize each other in order to cooperate. So in a way, on one side, constructive ambiguity and this kind of neutrality language allowed agreements to move, but it didn't contribute to the actual normalization of relations, because through this constructive ambiguity, what the EU effectively was doing was showing that both parties can work together, can cooperate even if they don't recognize each other. And so it basically kicking the can down the road. However, the problems emerged at the technical level. So when the implementation of the agreement started, then these kind of different phrases became an issue. And for instance, a phenomena that we are calling in a new book on dialogue with Recepi and Ciolacu is what we're calling the babushka practice. So you take one agreement, that is so-called agreement from the Brussels, you open, there is another. It's layers of layers, because they reached something in Brussels. When they went to the terrain to implement, okay, we now need another protocol to really define what we meant by this. Then you do the protocol. In the protocol, you have other issues. So let's do now a declaration of commitments or agreed conclusions, things like this. So there is different layers of agreements, and Shpetim has done a paper on this, because there is also a good question: how many actual agreements have been reached between Kosovo and Serbia? And there are different answers to this because of these kind of different layers. Some put it at 38, 39, others at 50, or even more, perhaps, depending on what would you call an agreement. So I fully would agree with the premise of your thesis that the language did produce, in a way, this kind of or maintained or fosters neutrality. I guess Shpetim.
Okay, yeah, Shpetim, please go
If
ahead.
I could add just a minute, yet Dani explained quite well, and then the EU people, they use constructive ambiguity. But I think one example that really reflects this constructive ambiguity is the language on the association. You have the key line where it says ASM has an overview over blah, blah, blah. And then first, it's incorrect in English. You can't say, I have an overview. You either provide an overview or you offer an overview. Or so it was a translation from Albanian or Serbian. And then in Serbia, the overview, they understood as responsibilities, as a legal responsibility. In Kosovo, they understood as monitoring. And 12 years later, we're still discussing what an overview is. And if you follow Edita Tahir, if you're still trying to explain, and then you have the Serbian government. So the language, it's not, for instance, as kind of American. Now, if you read, I think it's in the Reuters available, the draft that the US proposed for Russia, Ukraine, the first line is Ukraine gives 20% of the territory to Russia. I mean, that's clear. It's Brussels agreements are not like that. But I would be quite curious to read the thesis of Feriona's when she publishes it.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left for the meeting. We have 2 comments from Mr. Artan Ciolacu, who is an EU affairs practitioner in Pristina, and he currently works in the EU affairs section at the Office of the Prime Minister. And he had an observation, actually, not a question. And his opinion is that he thinks the EU is trying to hit too many birds with one stone with a dialogue. If any of you want to add something to this, please feel free to do so. And then another question for Dani by Aslan Zanunay, who is a recent MA graduate in international relations. He's asking whether some sort of same destiny or parallels between the war in Ukraine can be reserved for the Kosovo Serbia dialogue, and what is your perspective on the disengagement when it comes to Kosovo? Because there's a general perception that both the EU and the US might be more involved in Russia and Ukraine now, and as a result, there will be less attention, which is one of the worst scenarios that some analysts predict when it comes to the Kosovo Serbia dialogue. And then with this, we will just ask for a few concluding remarks, and perhaps we can wrap up.
Maybe start with Katarina and then work our way like we did that.
Thank you. Now it's a different topic. So you asked about student protests in well, it's difficult. I mean, the students as a group are very diverse, so we cannot really talk about one particular aspect or characteristic of this student mobilization or engagement. If we are talking about the protest in the context of Kosovo, I noticed on social networks that a lot of attention was paid on the flags that are visible during the protests, especially Nema Predaje, the flag. That was actually the flag that was introduced by Vučić San Danilo a few years ago. I'm not sure that students even know that somehow they're fighting against one person and they're using the flag of a son of that person. I think that what students manage is really this mobilization of ordinary citizens, so what we call the silent majority in Serbia, who we always believe that it's actually anti-Vučić or anti-SNS, but somehow that opposition parties so far they didn't find a way how to really mobilize these people and these voters. Students manage that. However, as I said, they're very diverse. They have very different ideological positions, even when it comes to some internal issues. So in the past 1 or 2 months, we have seen that one university is calling for expert, for example, government, transitional government. Then we have students from one faculty here in Belgrade who, in their press release, they went into this language discussion of what does it mean to have an expert government, who is an expert, how we will choose them, etc. And they were against that. So it's the same when it comes to other issues. But I think it's important that no matter what maybe they personally think, because we're talking about kids who grew up in the past 20 or so years in Serbia, and 13 years of that 20 years was practically dominated by the SNS in every way, in terms of media, in terms of propaganda, and so, I mean, of course, that maybe they're not always as liberal as progressive we would like them to be, since they're fighting for the rule of law and for the functioning institutions, as it's something that we from the civil society also believe in. But I think that so far they really managed to control the narrative, not to fall into this trap of discussing some things from the past that are very divisive still from the society. So in that sense, I think that they succeeded, and that they managed to, at least in Serbia, to cross some ethnic boundaries that existed for the past 30 years, especially with students from Novi Pazar. I mean, these pictures and this that we've seen in the past month, that they're really historical. And I think that this is, something that is really contributing to some internal peace building that I would say none of the civil society organization managed to do in the past 20 years. So I hope I answered your question, but I think that if I just want to add, I think that the fact that Nema Predaje flag was present on this protest somehow led to the unfair portrayal of the entire student process as nationalistic or chauvinistic. But we are talking about certain individuals, and it's a large group of people. It's very difficult to control them. So I mean, they of course make mistakes. Some of them are also, the elements that were included also by some security services. So I think it's easy to judge, but the situation is much more complex. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katarina. And we have 2 more questions, and one of them is directed specifically at Shpetim. And maybe with that, you can also wrap up your concluding remarks. It's by Denora Gashi, who asks that you mentioned that Kosovo felt betrayed by internationals regarding the lack of recognition from the 5 non-recognizers after the Ohrid agreement. She's asking if you can elaborate on the specific expectations Kosovo had and what actions by the internationals led to this feeling of betrayal. If the question, if you can answer, and also there's another question that asks what is the main point? What should be acceptable for both Kosovo and Serbia at this point to proceed the dialogue? And then maybe just briefly, and we can conclude.
Yeah, and the first question is that you have, and Kurti himself confirms that some international diplomats, American, you had told him in Ohrid that some non-recognized will move on, and that was primarily Greece. And Kosovo really hoped that, kind of believed that Greece will recognize, and maybe Slovakia. So these 2 countries. And actually, then the Dečani monastery land, we all give credit to Hovenier, but it was Dora Bakoyannis. She got Kurti to implement the Dečani monastery land. And then in the end, Kosovo gives the land to, I mean, it belonged to by court to the Dečani monastery, but Kurti implements it, and there is no Council of Europe. And then agrees to the Ohrid agreement, which is association, and there is no recognition by anyone. So in that sense, I don't share that feeling of betrayal, but this is how the people in the government feel, that they got nothing. And the land was gone. This is why they're so reluctant now to form the association. And I think at some point of agreement, for instance, I think Kosovo will form the association without blinking if there are some recognitions by EU members. But Kosovo will not form the association just because it's an obligation. And on what's something of the point to accept between Kosovo and Serbia, I don't know. I mean, the interests are very different. So it's, when we speak about people, maybe we can have different leaderships. Could be Katarina and me running Kosovo and Serbia. I don't think we'll be able to agree on a legally binding agreements because the interests of the people we represent are extremely different. But I think some medium, as Donnie mentioned, some legally binding agreements, some kind of de facto, if you could call it de facto, recognition whereby Kosovo forms association, and Serbia somehow recognizes Kosovo's jurisdictions or Kosovo's legal right over the entire territory of Kosovo. This is what I can see, kind of association for recognition of jurisdiction, not of independence.
Okay, thank you, Shpetim. Dan, if you just want to wrap up and we can close the meeting. Again, for more details on the report, you can find it on KCSS website.
Well, thank you, Jeta. And there are very good discussion happening, and perhaps we underestimated the interest for this conversation. So a reason to do something of a different kind of webinar, perhaps with more of an interactive discussion on this topic. But I see from Aslan Zenunay. And Aslan, also thank you for your message on LinkedIn. I haven't forgotten about that. First of all, I think on Ukraine and what will happen in Ukraine, if it will affect us, I think, from one perspective, you should be prepared for any kind of scenario, right? But I think the way forward is the option of integration in Kosovo. So basically, the way forward, I think, is implementing agreement on a path to normalization, including establishment of association of Kosovo Serb majorities. I think if we had done that earlier, I don't think today we would have been that, or the prospects of different ideas for a central compromise between Kosovo and Serbia, I think would have been less popular if we had moved with more effective implementation of integration policies. But I think in a larger context, it matters. Also for Ukraine, what the EU is doing or how the EU is behaving in Kosovo-Serbia normalization process. Because if you're Ukraine and you're watching how the EU is dealing in this process, and that it took 14 years and we are still nowhere closer to full normalization, then you might be skeptical as well of becoming part of a similar process as yourself. So our argument is that EU's role in facilitating and bringing to a conclusion the normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia is as important for its own agency and actorness as a global actor that is aspiring to be, and especially a test for its foreign and security policy. And there was another question related to what do I understand with legally binding agreement. I did answer that in writing, so it's just my own reading. I think it's about creating the agreement, making the agreement approved domestically, right? The big difference between 2013 agreement and 2023 agreement on the path to normalization, or as we call it, APN, the short, is that APN wasn't signed by either party, although Kosovo has expressed willingness and readiness to sign it. But President Vučić has declined to sign that paper. In 2013, if you look at the agreement, I think it's a very good also a case study of democratic validation, because at the time Kosovo government asked permission from Parliament to sign the agreement. Parliament gave consent. Government signed, then brought the agreement as an international law to be ratified in the Kosovo Parliament. And now that agreement is legally binding for any government in Kosovo, any institution. So my understanding would be that that should be the ambition towards what would you define legally binding as agreement reached in Brussels, signed, but also adopted by the highest decision-making authority in your own country. Otherwise, I don't know what other mechanisms could make it that strongly legally binding, because we see now the case for Kosovo when it comes to ASM, right? An own decision of our own constitutional court that says the establishment of ASM is part of the Kosovo's legal infrastructure in a way, and it is a legal obligation to establish it. We are bound by that agreement, and it's, I think, a euphemism where we are in a way reaching that level of some kind of a recognition between us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donny. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katarina and Shpetim, for your time and for contributing to drafting the report. So we'll close here, and we remain at your disposal for any question you may have. So have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.